run through those on the sick list. Keep Brother Terry in your prayers. He's got an appointment on the 23rd in Birmingham for another infusion. So it's going to be a bad week or a bad day to be traveling up in Birmingham, 23rd. But keep him in your prayers. And Janice, Holly is home, still in pain, but she's doing a lot, improving, getting over the surgery scars and that. Her biggest complaint right now is they had gone through one of her hips to get to where they put the cage in around the spine, and apparently they plucked on the nerve a little bit, so she's having some leg and hip issues there, pain. So keep her in your prayers. Diane is in the hospital, pneumonia, so keep her in your prayers. You see me back on my cane today. Mentally, I'm in great spirits, but physically, I think my whole spinal system has revolted against me today. So if you see me hobbling around, it's all in the neck and lower back area. So I'm sorry? Yes, sir. Well, I think what started the trigger on it was when I had to go up to Cahaba Heights to the hospital to visit Holly. So much traffic in my head, I was wobbling around, and that aggravated the 1 and 2. And then from there, everything else just went haywire, and probably overdid in carrying too many heavy things yesterday. So it's just a fact of getting old. We just live with it. Anybody I've missed on the sick, injured, or the younger clutches, Jeremy and Alyssa and theirs was out of town, and Rebecca got sick and started running about 103 fever, so they're back home with the Terry. You know how they're doing today, or hadn't heard today? But Jeremy is supposed to be here and let us know a little bit later how that's going. But keep them. Anybody else I missed? Okay. Miranda Stinson's father that had the series of chemo and all is not doing too good. About the same. Okay. And Brother Turner has been released from the hospital, and he's a free man again. Glad to have him here. Brother Cosby, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Amen. Just as a reminder, we're in the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is more or less a repeat of things that happened in the book of Exodus and Leviticus. And Moses is now talking to the younger generation that's going to go and get the promised land, whereas the older ones he talked to in Exodus and Leviticus, they're dying off in the wilderness. So we're not going to bog down with in a lot of detail on some of the things, because, for instance, Brother Jeremy got us through or touched on the first 21 verses of chapter 14 Wednesday night, and that basically deals with what foods are allowed for them, which are things that we don't deal with today. The only thing that we need to remember there is that God told them what they should do, and that's what they should do. When we pick up in verse 22, this deals with tithes. It goes and it goes all the way through Numbers. Well, let's just do it this way. Starting with verse 22, it says, "Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bringeth forth year by year." In essence, what does the word tithe mean? Put it back, set aside, promise, or whatever. You hear a lot of denominational folks today say that they tithe X amount to whatever church they go to, and that basically just means that they have whatever method they use to decide it. That's what they're going to give. That's going to be their contribution. When we pick up then from that, if we go down to verse 28 and 29 of the chapter, to me at least, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. It says, "At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates." Now, so we're not confused on it, if we look at what it says here, increase thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within the gates. This can be a confusing verse, but at the end of 3 years, in some manuscripts and some translations say at the end of each 3 or every 3 years, this is to be done, which would be proper. At every third year, this is what happens. Bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year. So every third year, the increase of that year is what you then bring into the gates. What happens to the tithe the other 2 years, the first and second year? Well, that's what's happening in the third year. In the other years, God has told them how that they are to bring their offerings and do their things to God. Here, it's indicating that they need to take care of their own on that third year, because it says, verse 29, "And the Levites, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand, which thou hast done." So if we just want to back up where we started in verse 22 and look at verse 23, the other 2 years, it says, "Thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which ye shall choose to place his name there, the tithe of thy corn, the wine, the oil, the firstlings of thy herds, and etc., that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God." So if we bring that down to the first century, where was the designated place for these feasts? It was Jerusalem. And then the other time, the third years, they do things for their own, within their own gates. Does that make sense, or have I just complicated things for you? Brother Clunch? Correct. And when we start the next chapter, chapter 15, it gives us another year. It gives us the 7th year. And it's referred to several different ways, the year of release or the sabbatical year, different things like that. But it says, "At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release." And then the following verses tell you the manner of the release. Now, what is so important about that is if we go back and look at Exodus 23, verse 10 real quick, Exodus 23 and 10. Unless Joel being here this morning, because he's always quick with the verses. Okay. Continue on down. Start with that verse and go till I tell you to stop, please. Gotcha. Okay, that's good enough for that section. So every seventh year, you're to just let the land lay. You're not supposed to plant anything. You're not supposed to take anything. And then that is for those that of less fortune, they can go in. And also, it is applicable that today it doesn't count. But back in my younger days when we was on the farm, we would have to rotate crops. Why would you rotate a crop? Maintain the soil. If you plant potatoes in this one area year after year after year, what's going to happen? You're going to deplete the nutrients that the potato needs, so you need to move the potato someplace else, and you need to plant something else there. You need to rotate the crop so that the soil will stay in balance. And also, it didn't hurt to let a section rest every 7 years just so it could get back to its own. We also used to go out and at the end of, we would burn all the grass in the yard. Why would you burn the grass in your yard? You don't do it today. What happens to what does burn grass do? It turns into ash, which the ash has the nutrients that go in and replenish the soil. And we don't do that today. We don't rotate crops. We don't do any of that because why? They've got all this artificial stuff out there on the market that substitutes for it. But then it goes in to say, every creditor that lendeth unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. So in other words, if Brother Golden dug down into his pocket and loaned me a huge amount of money, and I was struggling and I couldn't get that money paid back the seventh year, what happens? Forgives the debt. Everything's back to square one at the end of 7 years. If you go and look, also they would do things if you buy somebody's land or need it, they prorate it out in value to 7 years. In other words, if somebody is going to loan you, or you're going to buy a piece of property from somebody and it's the third year, you don't pay full price for it. You pay 3/7 of the price for it, because at the end of 7 years, they get it back. So they had all kind of logical, good, legal stuff to protect everybody. Today, everybody wants their hand in everybody else's pocket. Here, they were trying to keep things on an even keel. In verse 3, even of the foreigner that may exact it against thee, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. So everything is given back. And basically, that takes us up through verse 11. And verse 11 says, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thy hand wide unto thy brother, to the poor, and to the needy in thy land. If we move that to today's time, is there needy in the land of the United States of America? Is there needy in is there needy in Alabama? Has there always been? Will there always be? But what are we to try to do for the needy? We're to try to take care of them. We're to try to help them. Verse 12, if thy brother, a Hebrew or an Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee and serve thee 6 years, and then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee, and when thou sendest him out free from thee, thou shalt not let him go away empty. Okay. There have been some people who have tried to compare slavery to what takes place in the Old Testament. You cannot compare the two. They are two totally different things, even though a lot of places in the Bible refer to servants as slaves, but there was different types. But here it points out that if you have paid for somebody's servitude, at the end of the time, you not only set them free, but you set them up so that they can make it on their own. The following verses: when thou sendest him out free, verse 14, thou shalt furnish him liberally out of thy flock, out of thy floor, out of thy winepress, of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him. Furnish basically means gift. You give it to them so that they can, again, back in the old days in the United States, I wish I had been alive during that period of time where I would have gotten my 40 acres and a mule. They tried to set you up for success. But here, if once you let somebody go free, you give them the necessary things so that they can make it. And it's all for this reason. Verse 15 tells them the whys. Thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Therefore, I command thee in this thing today. The reason you're to do this to your fellow man is because God did it to and for you. Questions, comments through that section? Right. We was just about to pull that one in. We're going to be looking at verse 16, and then 18 brings it to it. It says, verse 16, and it shall be, if he say unto thee, I will not go away from thee, because he loveth thee and thine house, because he is well with thee, then thou shalt take an awl and thrust it through his ear into the doorpost, and he shall be thy servant forever. And also unto thy maidservant thou shalt do likewise. Again, the people that try to compare the two of recent history slavery and this slavery is when a person back in this day and age was bound as a servant for life, how did they do it? They volunteered for it. They wanted to work for that person for life. For what reason? They had been treated well because it says they loved them. Do you love somebody that doesn't treat you well? And then, because it is well with thee, he treated you well, you loved him, you wanted the security, so you wanted to work for that person for the rest of your life. And then when, as Brother Clarence mentioned, verse 18 says, it shall not seem hard unto thee when thou sendest him away from thee, for he hath been worth a double hired servant to thee, in serving thee 6 years, and the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all that thou doest. Which implies, as Brother Clarence mentioned, that they worked. They were good workers. They weren't lazy or slothful or needing to be taken care of. What worker, for those of you that have been in a position of management, maybe with the ability to hire and fire, or at least with the input of who gets hired and fired, who did you regret losing most? The lazy or the hard worker? You didn't want to get rid of the hard worker. And that's where all that ties together. He was a good worker, so in all my years that I was in that position, if somebody wanted to leave me and go to some place where they could do better, I never wanted to hold them back. I wanted them to excel in every opportunity they had. And I believe that sort of comes in here. You set them free, you give them the tools they need, you give them what they need, hoping that they're going to excel. Brother Clint? It's correct. Brother Clint said the old adage, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him to fish, you feed him a lifetime. Now, starting in verse 19, it says, all the firstling males. Now, this comes into the qualifications, and all the firstling males that come of the herd and of the flock thou shalt sanctify unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt do no work with the firstling of thy bullock, nor shear the firstlings of thy sheep. Thou shalt eat it before the Lord thy God year by year in the place which the Lord shall choose, thou and thy household. And if there be any blemish therein, as if it be lame or blind, or have any ill blemish, thou shalt not sacrifice it unto the Lord. What does all that mean? God wanted the pure. God wanted the best. Didn't want them to work, they were set aside, didn't want them with blemishes or anything else. So if God wanted the pure of the animals to be the sanctified, set apart, sacrificed, how does that equate to us being Christians today? Particularly if we take into account the verse that says that we are to be presented to God spotless, without blemish. What does that mean? Is any of us ever going to be spotless and pure? Except immediately when you come out of the... But as you live your life as a Christian, are we ever going to be totally spotless and pure? We make every attempt we can. We try as hard as we can. Christ's blood continually cleanses us. But when we are presented to Christ, we're supposed to be in that manner. Christ's blood has cleansed us, and when we're presented, we're going to be spotless, blemish-free, because that's what he wanted from the old here. Verse 23 then says, only thou shalt not eat the blood thereof, thou shalt pour it upon the ground. We've discussed that in the past as to blood matters, so I won't get into that. But questions or comments then through chapter 15? Chapter 16 deals with the Passover, and then we get into other feasts, and starting with verse 9. But in verse 1 it says, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock, of the herd, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. The Lord chooses to place his name someplace where all of these are to take place. And we remember it it's to be remembered in the month of Abib, because that's the month. Was Abib January? Pardon? More likely March or April, our calendar, but why is it called the first month then? Because when he started to set them up, the Abib was going to be the first month, the month that they departed. Absolutely correct. So that takes us through verse 8 is dealing with the Passover at a particular location. Verse 9 through 12 deals with Feast of Weeks. Now, we're not going to go through and list all these feasts because we don't do them, and it's a lot of memory work. but just to sort of keep things in order, there was more feast than the Passover. Verse 9 through 12 is the Feast of the Weeks. Verse 13 through 17 is Feast of the Booths. And then when we get down to verse 18, we start dealing with justice, laws, and rules. Verse 18 says, Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, throughout the tribes, and thou shalt judge the poor. Somebody else read those last three words. With just judgment. What does that mean? Righteous judgment, just judgment, according to the law, fair. I hate that word fair. Let's change it to equitable, equal. As we continue with it, thou shalt not rest. What does the word rest? And I'm using King James, so if you look at New King James or some of the other versions of the Bible, what would rest mean? I'm sorry, take away or pervert justice or judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise and pervert the words of the righteous. So, when all of these judges were set up, then they were supposed to go by the law. They were not supposed to take the person into account, give no preference to people, judge on facts, judge righteously, judge justly. Brother Clunch, you look like you're just dying to say something. Brother Clunch just brought up the sore subject of the impeachment going on today. They're consumed with this idea. But we see this throughout our history and even currently. And we've even got something built into our laws that say if there's going to be a judge and a certain case comes before him, he can recuse himself. Why would somebody recuse themselves from a trial? They know the person, or they feel like they might not be able to, or there might be the perception that they're not being impartial due to their knowing them. We also have, and if any of you have ever been called for jury duty, what is one of the first, not the first, but in the Vordi experience of selecting a jury, what's one of the questions? Before that, do you know either one of the individuals on trial, or do you know either the prosecuting, or have you had any experience with them? And if you answer yes, then the question, can you still be impartial, comes up. So today, the judicial system is supposed to be based on the same grounds that this is based on: fair, equitable, not taking into account. If we go back into history just a smidgen, if you were in Chicago in the 20s and 30s, there's a term called graft and greed, and I mean the political system there was just consumed. I was during the days of Prohibition, and everybody had their hand behind their back, taking money to see the things that there was partial justice doled out. Today, it is my opinion that still happens to a degree. Not in all places, but it still happens today. Shouldn't, but does. Verse 20, that which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Telling you that God knows whether or not you're doing all these things the right way. And if you do them the right way, that's when God's going to benefit you. And if you're not, he's going to take action, necessary action. Questions, comments then through chapter or verse 20. 21 and 22, thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of the Lord thy God, which thou shalt make thee. Why wouldn't you plant a grove of trees near an altar? If you go back and look at Ashtaroth, that is the location where the idols took place. And if you look at the rest of the scene, I stopped short because I'm playing the devil. I stopped short of reading that entire verse. Look at the last where I didn't go. I said plant trees near unto the altar. Look at the rest of it. Of the Lord thy God, which thou shalt make thee. In other words, you're setting up the God, the golden calf. You are making the idol. You're making the images. You're planting the grove. And all of that goes back to, let's just slide back a little bit. Deuteronomy 7. 7 verse 5. I'm sorry? Right. If you'd, verse 5 in chapter 7. But thus shall ye deal with them. Ye shall destroy their altars, break down their images, cut down their groves, burn their graven images with fire. So that's where all of that ties together, because they were setting up, they wasn't to set up any images or make those places that would allude to Asherah or Ashtaroth. In verse 22, neither shalt thou set thee up any image which the Lord thy God hateth. So those two verses tie together, but again, you're not to make any images or do anything that other than worship the one true God. Questions, comments? Chapter 17. Let's see what's happening. Chapter 17. Thou shalt not sacrifice unto the Lord thy God any bull, sheep, where there is a blemish, or any evil favoredness, for that is an abomination unto the Lord thy God. This we covered the chapter before when it was said that the Lord wanted the pure, wanted the clean. Verse 6 of this chapter says, at the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of one witness he shall not be put to death. This goes back into the justice system. Today, in a court of law, if they have one witness against somebody, what do they really prefer to do before that it's turned over to the jury? It's a fancy word called corroborate. I mean, they might not have another witness, but what they do then is they try to figure out how honest and sincere, and they try to figure out all they can about the one witness to make sure that he is a just witness. But here, they want it done under two or three witnesses to make sure that there's no collusion there. The hands of the witness then shall be the first upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So thou shalt put the evil away from among you. So those that have brought a charge against somebody where that person is worthy of death, back in these days, they generally stoned them. Who was to throw the first rocks? The witnesses. Why would the rest of the people then be charged with the duty of continuing? All responsible? Kathy? It's going to take multiple throws. That is correct, unless one just didn't. If you're a good shot in the right target. Just because one or two witnesses brought forward that, who made the judgment that those should be put to death? The rest of the folks. So it is dealing with the unity of effort there. That's an excellent point. Brother Clance just brought up in John chapter 8. Remember the woman that was caught in adultery? And what did Christ do? Those without sin cast the first stone. And when he looked back up, where were all the people? Where was the woman? The woman was standing there, but where were the rest of the people? No stones thrown. Everybody went their own way. And then he talked to her and said, sin no more. Verse 8 through 13 then deals with legal decisions, which we won't take time to go into. And verse 14 through 20 then deals with the laws. When we get to chapter 18, verses 1 through 8 deal with priests and Levites and their portions of things. When we get to verse 9 through 14, it deals with abominable practices. And I wanted to spend a little time in here. I don't have but just a few minutes. But when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. Let's back up to make his son or daughter pass through the fire. What does that have to do with? Who was one of the pagan gods that? Molech was the big one there, and how did people worship Molech? They had an image of Molech, and they would heat that image up to the spot where it was glowing red hot, and then they would place their infants in the arms of that idol and allow the children to be burned to death. That is not what God tells people to do. So here he says, don't make your daughters or sons pass through the fire. And then don't use divination or observe times or an enchanter or a charmer or a consulter with familiar spirits or a wizard or a necromancer. Other versions have a different word, but what does the word necromancer mean? Talk to the dead. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because these abominations the Lord thy God hath driven them out from the land before thee. Correct. King Saul put them together. If you look at it logically, by the Bible, all the rationale you can come up with, is there anyone today that can talk to the dead? No. And the reason I said today is because back in Bible times, Jesus and different things could take place. But after that, no. Because what happens, and this is one area where I did a sermon on several years ago dealing with all the spirits and demons and things like that. But what happens when a person dies? Spirit leaves the body, and where does the spirit go? Back to God that created. So there are no spirits hanging around, trapped between here and there, waiting to move on to other places. When a person dies, the spirit leaves the body, it's returned to God. End of conversation. Verse 15, the Lord thy God will raise thee up a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. So verse 15 through 22 of the chapter then just tells you that God is going to set somebody else up in the place of Moses, and who's been chosen to do that? Okay. Verse 21, and thou shalt say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord thy God hath not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that it is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken, but the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him. The reason I wanted to get to that verse and close out the chapter was many years ago. Brother Klotz can probably name the time and date and who. I can't recall it right offhand. The world was going to come to an end on a specific day. Didn't happen. Well, I got to adjust my math. It's going to happen on a certain year and date. Didn't happen. Well, I miscalculated somewhere. Now it's going to happen. What does the Bible tell us about when this earth is going to end? Nobody knows. If nobody knows except God, not even the angels in heaven, there is no information put in this Bible where anybody can do any math, stretch of the imagination, crossword puzzles, anything that you want to combine. If the Bible tells us that nobody knows, he's coming like a thief in the night, Christ says that only God in heaven knows, not even the angels, why do we waste our time listening to those folks out there that come up with all these predictions of end times? Pardon? They know better. Okay. I know I have rushed through this, but we have completed chapter 18. Brother Clunch. Right. Anything else? Thank y'all. It's I saw Luke counting, so it's only going to be about another minute before the bell rings. So I want to thank y'all so much for your attention and comments.